as its author was Thomas Atkinson, the third Bishop of North Carolina. It bespeaks a palpable fear on the part of white leadership, a fear that white control would be relinquished once blacks formed their own religious institutions. Blacks' own explanation of the Exodus was simple. It was a flight from white domination and an opportunity to exercise black leadership. It was, to use Alexander Crummell's phrase, a drift to the black preacher. 2, the mass migration took place, in part in response to the successful proselytizing efforts of black Methodists and Baptists, and their emphasis upon emotional feeling as a sign of conversion. But there were other factors at work that made escape from the Episcopal Church a desirable goal for blacks. Fully 3 years before emancipation, there came into being a Confederate Episcopal Church, whose House of Deputies promised to, quote, recognize its obligations to provide for the spiritual wants of our brethren who are in the providence of God, and have been committed to our sympathy and care by the national institution of slavery. In other words, keep them in slavery. At the same time, the House of Bishops of the Confederate Church attacked abolitionists and reminded white masters to defend the institution of slavery, which, they said, God has created and which man cannot, consistently with Christianity, annul. While black Episcopalians made efforts to be in communion with other black Christians and to strike a blow for black empowerment, the Episcopal Church had, through the founding of the Confederate Church of the Episcopal Church, which apparently was allowed to exist cheek to jowl with its northern cousins, had gone on record as upholding and defending the institution of slavery. It is not surprising that black Episcopalians were motivated to flee to Christian communities that appeared to be more hospitable. See, one of the myths of the Episcopal Church is that we never split over slavery, as did other denominations. That's not entirely true. The Confederate Church was in fact formed, and the northern Episcopalians kind of took a wink at it and said, well, we don't want to offend our slave-holding brethren. And so what they did, when the General Convention met, I think in 1862, they called roll. They'd say, Alabama, nobody would answer. Mississippi, nobody answered. Georgia, nobody answered. And so they just assumed they had to take a potty break or something. And then in 1865, when these churches, these states had been defeated in the war, they came back and they said, Alabama, here, Georgia, present. And they just resumed as if nothing had happened. That's so Episcopalian. The polite view of life. We have seen how the Episcopal Church has consistently regarded blacks as something of an anomaly. The presence of blacks has at times been considered an embarrassment, an incongruity, a thorn in the church's flesh, and still at other times a presence which many wish would go away. The irony is that when many blacks after the Civil War did just that, the church felt morally bound not only to minister to the faithful remnant, but to reach out to evangelize a new class of people called the freedmen. The first agency established for work among blacks was the Freedmen's Commission, established by the General Convention of 1865. Under the aegis of the Board of Missions, by the time it made its report to the 1868 General Convention, it had changed its name to the Commission of Home Missions to Colored People. Within 3 years of its founding, $100,000 was raised, a prodigious sum in those days, to establish parochial and industrial schools, among which was St. Augustine's Normal School and Collegiate Institute, founded in 1867 for the purpose of training colored teachers and later expanded to prepare men for the ordained ministry. Today, its successor institution where we meet today is the only institution funded by the Freedmen's Commission still in existence. The work of the Commission was, for the most part, however, less than successful. The ordination program in particular failed to meet expectations. In many cases, the canonical processes could not be observed because the prospective ordinands did not belong to a parish which could sponsor them. That was not an insurmountable problem. All you had to do was adopt somebody and make them your parish, but it was an excuse, you see. Moreover, the white church leaders were reluctant to sponsor blacks for ministry, believing them to be intellectually or even morally deficient. Of the 20 blacks ordained between 1866 and 1877, 14 remained in deacon's orders, and of those advanced to the priesthood, only 2 served in southern dioceses where the need was the greatest. The rest, most of them, were shipped off to Africa. But it remained that such failures were due to more basic flaws. Number one, the first flaw had to do with how the church's racial perceptions caused blacks to be understood, namely as beneficiaries of a distant program of mission, such as Liberia. Blacks on those shores were seen as a group to be one for Christ, that's W-O-N, and the church. Since such a view could predominate because it was virtually impossible for Episcopalians, especially in the South, a lost war and an Emancipation Proclamation notwithstanding, to recognize those formerly in bondage, indeed those whom they had previously owned, to recognize them as equal citizens under the law. Number 2, the second flaw was that the church's patronizing attitude, under which it found it necessary to protect and provide for former slaves, resulted, as Bragg observed, in an atmosphere which created a dependence on the part of blacks, whereby colored congregations were attached to white parishes or were placed entirely under supervision and direction of the bishops. The third flaw was that since the Freedmen's Commission was instituted as a national church program, there was a distinct expectation that the whole church should underwrite the costs involved. However, there was resentment, chiefly on the part of Southerners, that the whole church should determine local policy. The fourth flaw was the mistaken belief on the part of the church that simply by providing vocational and religious training, simply by eradicating so-called ignorance, the problems of the black race in America would be solved. By making good citizens and Christians of them, the thinking went, they would be equipped to enter society, or in the words of Bishop Atkinson, to understand and enjoy the principles of freedom. The Episcopal Church, in attempting to redouble its efforts to bring the gospel to blacks, was hoisted on its own petard. While sincere in its efforts to improve the lot of African Americans, it persisted in treating the group as separate but unequal. Unable or unwilling to understand the endemic nature of racism, every act of the Commission succeeded in further segregating the race, thereby creating a parallel and inferior ecclesiastical and social institution. The commissions might have been more successful had the church raised up more black clerical leaders. Parishes established during this period under black leadership flourished, among them St. Luke's, Tarboro, and St. Mark's, Wilmington. But parishes historically which were founded by and run by whites often died on the vine. Now, we move to the question of what I call a racial episcopate in the Episcopal Church or in a Catholic Church. The Episcopal Church, in the last decades of the 19th century, found itself on the horns of a dilemma. The Episcopal Church always finds itself on the horns of one dilemma or another. It had long been on record as being desirous of increasing in the number of African Americans in its fold, and it believed in principle that a black bishop might be instrumental in such a plan. The problem was that bishops are elected by local dioceses, and such an election would mean that the bishop so chosen would have jurisdiction over both white and Negro churches, a concept which at the time was untenable to most white Episcopalians, North and South. The idea of an ideal solution to create the office of suffragan bishop for colored work was proposed in 1874. And under such a plan, the bishop would have jurisdiction, that is to say the colored bishop, only over people of his own race, while being responsible to a white diocese bishop. Well, that's just perfect, isn't it? No action, however, was taken at that time. Another solution was the Black Missionary District Plan, imprecisely called the Sewanee Canon. It was defeated in 1883. All the southern dioceses met on the Great Mountain in Sewanee to decide what to do for what they call the late slave population.